Hi everyone! In this video, we will be reviewing the concept of graphing on the Cartesian plane. Most of the graphs you've seen so far in math has been done on the Cartesian plane. This is where we describe positions using the horizontal and vertical distances. This may look familiar to you as the x-axis and the y-axis. Another way to describe plotting x and y coordinates on the Cartesian plane is rectangular coordinates. And that's because when we plot a point, we want to look at the horizontal distance, which we'll call x, and the vertical distance, which we'll call y. And when we do that, we end up with a rectangle. The Cartesian plane is divided into 4 quadrants, and we name these quadrants going counterclockwise, starting where the x and y are both positive. And we'll call this quadrant 1 with the Roman numeral 1. The shorthand for that is just Q1. Going counterclockwise, this will now be quadrant 2, where the x is negative and the y is positive. Going to the next quadrant, quadrant 3, where the x is negative and the y is negative. And finally, we have quadrant 4, where the x is positive and the y is negative. Anything we plot on this graph is measuring the distance from the axis. And so we start with the point where the y-axis and the x-axis intersect, which is where they cross. And this point will be our starting point, which we label 0, 0, because the distance from the x-axis is 0 and the distance from the y-axis is 0. And we'll always write our coordinates as x, y, measuring the horizontal distance first and then the vertical distance along the y-axis. And so, with that in mind, when we talk about the x-axis, we know that any value or any point along the x-axis, y will be equal to 0, because the vertical distance from the x-axis is 0. With that in mind, we know that anything above the x-axis will result in positive y values, and anything below the x-axis will result in negative y values. The same idea can be applied to the y-axis, but in this case, when we go left to right, we're measuring the distance of x, the distance away from the y-axis. And so if we plot a point on the y-axis, we know that our x values will always be equal to 0 because we're not going anywhere left or right. But anything to the right of the y-axis will result in positive x values, and anything to the left of the y-axis will result in negative x values. So for example, if you were asked to plot the point +2, -1, how would you do that? Well, let's start with putting some tick marks on our graph to show a 3 by 3 graph. We always describe these coordinates as x first, then y. And so remember that the horizontal axis, that's the one going left to right, is the x-axis. And the vertical axis going up and down is the y-axis. And so if the coordinate point is 2, -1, we're going to count 1, 2, and down 1, since it's a negative y. And this would be our coordinate 2, -1. Which quadrant would this be in? Remember that we label this quadrant 1, starting with where x is positive and y is positive, and then we go counterclockwise. Quadrant 2, quadrant 3, and quadrant 4. So 2, -1 would be in quadrant 4. Let's try one more. What if you were asked to plot the point -3, -2? Well, we're going to start with the x first. And when we go to the left, 1, 2, 3, that would be -3. And we're going to go down 2, 1, 2. And that would get us the point -3, -2. And this point would be in quadrant 3. And if we wanted to represent every single point between the two coordinates 2, -1 and -3, -2, all we would simply have to do is draw a line connecting the two. Thank you for joining me and learning about graphs today. In the next video, we will talk about how to find the distance between two coordinates. See you next time.